His cruel plan was perfect. Force the help to embarrass herself at his birthday gala. When his father's black waitress approached the Steinway, wealthy Alexander Thornton smiled, anticipating her humiliation. Then her fingers touched the keys. What followed silenced the elite crowd and shattered generations of prejudice, revealing a secret connection that would forever change both their lives. Maya Johnson gripped her bus ticket tightly as she watched the mansion appear through the trees. Thornton Estate looked exactly as it had 6 months ago. Massive stone walls, perfectly trimmed hedges, and that sense of old money that no amount of modern renovations could hide. She'd sworn never to come back here, yet here she was. "Last stop, miss," the driver called. Maya stepped off the bus, adjusting her simple black backpack. Her worn sneakers crunched on the gravel driveway as workers rushed past carrying boxes of expensive champagne and decorations. Giant silver balloons spelling 30 floated above the entrance. Alexander Thornton's birthday celebration promised to be as excessive as the man himself. "Maya, is that you?" She turned to see Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, hurrying toward her with arms outstretched. "Look at you. Still too skinny. Are your classes going well? 3rd year of medical school now, right?" Maya returned the hug, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon polish. "Yes, ma'am. Finals were brutal, but I passed everything." Mrs. Wilson's smile faded. "Your father will be so happy to see you. He's been... Well, come on in." Maya's stomach tightened. She'd received the call 3 days ago. Her father's heart condition had worsened. The doctor bills were piling up. When Mrs. Wilson mentioned the Thorntons needed extra staff for the big party and would pay triple the usual rate, Maya had swallowed her pride and packed her bags. The kitchen was chaos. Caterers shouting orders, servers practicing their formal posture, and the head chef cursing at a young assistant who'd dropped a tray of canapes. "Wait here," Mrs. Wilson said. "I'll get your father." Maya stood awkwardly in the corner, watching the frantic preparations. This world felt alien now. For 3 years, she'd lived on campus, surrounded by textbooks and study groups. Her hands, once calloused from carrying trays, were now marked with pen stains and paper cuts. "Maya!" Her father's voice was softer than she remembered. Joseph Johnson stood in the doorway, his tall frame somehow diminished. The crisp butler's uniform hung slightly loose on his shoulders, and his dark skin had taken on an ashen undertone. But his smile, that hadn't changed. "Dad!" She rushed to him, careful not to embrace him too tightly. "You should have told me sooner. I would have..." "Nonsense." He straightened his posture, the professional mask sliding back into place. "I've served the Thorntons for 45 years. A little heart trouble won't stop me from doing my job." But Maya saw how his hand trembled as he adjusted his tie, how he subtly leaned against the doorframe for support. "Mr. Thornton insists I take it easy," Joseph continued. "He's even hired a temporary replacement for tonight's event." "Richard Thornton or his son?" Maya asked, knowing the answer. Joseph's expression said everything. "Mr. Richard has been most generous." Their conversation was interrupted by a booming voice from the hallway. "Joseph, there you are." Richard Thornton strode into the kitchen, his silver hair perfectly styled, his casual sweater probably costing more than Maya's monthly rent. Despite his wealth, there was a warmth to his blue eyes as he spotted Maya. "And who's this young lady?" Joseph stood straighter. "Sir, you remember my daughter, Maya." Recognition lit Richard's face. "Of course, the medical student. Hopkins, right? How are your studies going?" Maya was surprised he remembered. "Very well, sir. Just finished my cardiology rotation." "Excellent. Yeah, that brilliant mind of yours shouldn't go to waste. Joseph has been showing everyone your latest test scores." Maya glanced at her father, who had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "I hope you'll join us for longer this time," Richard continued. "Last summer you disappeared so quickly." Before Maya could respond, the kitchen door swung open violently. Alexander Thornton marched in, his designer shoes clicking against the tile floor. Where his father exuded old-money confidence, Alexander carried himself with entitled impatience. "Father, the florist has completely misunderstood my vision for tonight. I specifically requested blue orchids, not these purple monstrosities." Richard sighed. They look perfectly fine, Alexander. Fine isn't what I'm paying for. Alexander's eyes scanned the room, landing momentarily on Maya before dismissing her as unimportant. Joseph, would you please explain to them that when I say Pantone 2718, I don't mean 2726? Of course, Mr. Alexander. Joseph's voice changed subtly, more formal, less familiar than with the elder Thornton. Alexander's phone rang. Dad, it's the investors. I have to take this. His demeanor shifted instantly, voice becoming warm and respectful. Yes, Mr. Hammerson. So good of you to call. As Alexander walked out with his father, Maya caught him mouthing, "Fix it," to Joseph with a cold glare that contradicted his phone voice completely. Joseph exhaled heavily once they left, his hand moving to his chest. Dad? Maya stepped forward, alarmed. I'm fine, he insisted, but the pallor of his skin betrayed him. Just need my medication. Maya reached for her father's arm. Where is it? I'll get it for you. Upstairs, my quarters. He smiled weakly. I told you coming here was unnecessary. As they slowly climbed the servants' stairs, Maya noticed a framed photograph she'd never seen before. A younger Joseph standing beside Richard Thornton, both men smiling broadly. Between them stood a beautiful woman with kind eyes holding the hands of a small boy, the late Eleanor Thornton and her son Alexander. Maya paused, studying the image. The boy's eyes held none of the coldness she'd just witnessed. Something had changed him. Mrs. Eleanor was different, Joseph whispered, following her gaze. She treated everyone like family. What happened to her? Maya asked. Joseph's eyes clouded. That, my dear, is part of why this house has never been the same, and why I fear for what Alexander is becoming. As they continued up the stairs, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that returning to Thornton Estate had connected her to something larger than a simple catering job, something that began long before she was born. Maya helped her father take his medication, worry knotting her stomach as she watched him breathe deeply, eyes closed. Joseph's room was small but immaculate, a lifetime of service reflected in its perfect order. I'm feeling better already, he insisted, though color hadn't returned to his face. You should head downstairs. Mrs. Wilson will need help setting up the ballroom. Maya hesitated. Dad? I'll rest for 20 minutes, then join you. His tone left no room for argument. The Thornton name may be on my paycheck, but my pride is all mine. Reluctantly, Maya made her way to the main floor. The mansion was even grander than she remembered. Crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and artwork that belonged in museums. As a child, she'd been allowed here only when accompanying her father. Still, there was something hauntingly familiar about these halls. She found Mrs. Wilson in the ballroom directing a team of workers. There you are. Can you help polish the silverware? And the glasses need arranging on that table near the... Mrs. Wilson paused, noticing Maya's distraction. Maya stood frozen, staring at the magnificent Steinway grand piano positioned at the far end of the room. Black and gleaming under the chandelier light, it dominated the space like a sleeping giant. Beautiful, isn't it? Mrs. Wilson said softly. Hardly ever played these days. Such a shame. Maya's fingers tingled at her sides as if remembering something her mind couldn't quite grasp. A half-formed memory swirled at the edges of her consciousness, gentle hands guiding hers across ivory keys, the smell of lavender perfume, warm laughter. Maya? She blinked. Sorry, yes, the silverware. As she polished forks and knives worth more than her textbooks, Maya's eyes kept drifting to the piano. A hired pianist would play tonight. She'd overheard the staff discussing it. Alexander had insisted on a renowned performer from New York, someone whose presence would impress his business associates. The ballroom doors burst open. Speak of the devil. This is completely unacceptable, Alexander announced, trailing a nervous-looking young server who carried a tray of appetizers. These are supposed to be arranged by color gradient, not tossed together like a salad. The server, a boy barely out of his teens, stammered. I'm sorry, sir. The chef said... I don't care what the chef said. I left very specific instructions. Alexander plucked an appetizer from the tray and examined it with disdain. And these are lukewarm. Do you think my guests want lukewarm food? Mrs. Wilson stepped forward. Mr. Alexander, we'll fix it right away. But Alexander wasn't finished. Who hired this incompetent staff? This is my 30th birthday, not some backyard barbecue. He turned to the young server whose hands were now visibly shaking. What's your name? Tyler, sir. Well, Tyler, Alexander mocked. Perhaps fast food is more your speed. I'd recommend applying to the McDonald's down the road after tonight. Maya's knuckles turned white around the silver fork she was polishing. The cruelty was so casual, so unnecessary. Tyler's eyes welled with tears. I need this job, sir. My mother's sick and… That sounds like a personal problem, Alexander cut him off. That's quite enough. Joseph stood in the doorway, his butler mask firmly in place despite his pallor. He'd changed into his formal uniform, every button fastened, every crease perfect. Tyler, Joseph said calmly, please take those back to the kitchen. Tell Chef Andre I requested the plating be redone according to Mr. Alexander's specifications. The young man practically ran from the room. Alexander's expression darkened. Joseph, I don't appreciate being undermined in my own home. Of course not, sir. Joseph's voice remained perfectly modulated. I merely thought to expedite the solution to your concern. A tense silence fell. Maya held her breath, watching her father stand tall despite everything. Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, annoyance flashing across his face. My father wants to review the guest list. We'll discuss this later. As Alexander strode out, Joseph's professional composure crumbled. He clutched at his chest, face contorting in pain. Dad! Maya dropped the silverware with a clatter, rushing to his side. Mrs. Wilson, help! They guided Joseph to a nearby chair. His breathing was labored, his skin clammy. It's nothing, he insisted between gasps. Just need a moment. This isn't nothing, Maya argued, already checking his pulse. You need rest, not this stress. Her medical training took over as she loosened his collar. Deep breaths. That's it. Mrs. Wilson hovered anxiously. Should I call an ambulance? Joseph shook his head firmly. His medication, Maya explained. It's upstairs. I need to… I'll get it, Mrs. Wilson offered, hurrying away. Alone with her father, Maya knelt beside his chair. Dad, please. This job isn't worth your life. Joseph's eyes, though pained, held determination. This house, this family, there's more to it than you know, Maya. What do you mean? He seemed about to explain when they were interrupted by a deep voice. Everything all right here? Richard Thornton stood in the doorway, concern etched on his face. Just a small episode, sir. Joseph tried to stand, but Richard waved him down. For God's sake, Joseph, stay seated. Richard approached, genuine worry in his eyes. Should I call Dr. Merritt? No need to trouble your personal physician, sir. Richard turned to Maya. Make sure he rests. And Joseph, that's an order, not a request. As Richard left, Maya noticed someone watching from the hallway. Alexander stood partially hidden behind a column, his expression unreadable as he observed her tending to her father. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, something shifted in his gaze. Curiosity replacing contempt. For a moment, Maya thought she saw something familiar in his features. Not the cruel man who'd just humiliated Tyler, but something reminiscent of the little boy in the photograph. Then he was gone, disappearing down the hallway without a word. Mrs. Wilson returned with the medication. As Maya helped her father drink water with his pills, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander Thornton was seeing her clearly for the first time, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Neither of them noticed Richard Thornton pausing by the piano, his hand resting briefly on its polished surface, lost in memories of his own. The mansion buzzed with final preparations as evening approached. Caterers rushed through hallways, florists made last-minute adjustments to centerpieces, and staff practiced their serving routines. Maya had convinced her father to rest in his quarters, promising to check on him regularly. She carried fresh linens toward the guest bathrooms when she heard footsteps behind her. You, girl. Maya turned to find Alexander Thornton watching her with narrowed eyes. Up close, his tailored suit probably cost more than her semester's tuition. His cologne smelled expensive, and his watch glinted gold under the hallway lights. "Yes, Mr. Thornton?" Maya kept her voice professionally neutral despite the annoyance bubbling inside her. Alexander studied her face. "You look familiar. Have you worked here before?" "Last summer, sir. For a few weeks." "That's not it." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Where did Joseph find you? You don't carry yourself like the usual help." Maya clutched the linens tighter. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You handled that situation earlier. Professionally." His tone suggested this surprised him. "Almost like you've had medical training." "I'm a third-year medical student at Hopkins." Alexander's eyebrows rose. "A doctor playing waitress? That's quite the career downgrade." "I'm not playing anything," Maya replied evenly, "and I'm not a doctor yet." His eyes traveled over her simple black uniform. "Still doesn't explain why you're folding towels instead of, I don't know, cutting people open or whatever medical students do. Summer jobs pay bills." Alexander leaned against the wall, blocking her path. His demeanor shifted to something almost charming, a mask she suspected he wore often. "Hopkins is expensive. Must be difficult without wealthy parents. Or," his smile turned predatory, "perhaps you have a wealthy benefactor. Pretty girl like you." Maya's cheeks burned with anger and humiliation. "I have scholarships and student loans." "Ah, yes, the American dream. Drowning in debt for a piece of paper." He chuckled. "What specialty are you pursuing?" "Plastic surgery. That's where the real money is, I hear." "Cardiology." Something flickered across Alexander's face. Surprise, perhaps respect, before his arrogant mask returned. "Heart doctor. How touching." He straightened, checking his watch. "Well, don't let me keep you from your towel folding." Maya moved to step around him, but Alexander didn't budge. "One more thing. That older gentleman, Joseph. You seem quite concerned about his health. He's a good man. Indeed, loyal service for decades. But his condition seems serious." Alexander's tone was casual, but his eyes were calculating. Perhaps too serious for someone in his position. Maya fought to keep her expression neutral. Was he threatening her father's job? "Mr. Joseph will be fine, sir." "Mr. Joseph?" Alexander's eyes widened slightly. Then understanding dawned. "Wait, you're his daughter." Before Maya could respond, a voice called from down the hall. "Alex, guests are arriving." Alexander's gaze remained fixed on Maya, reassessing everything about her. Joseph never mentioned a daughter in medical school. He's a private person. Evidently. Alexander finally stepped aside. "We'll continue this fascinating conversation later, Miss Johnson." Maya watched him stride away, her heart racing. Something about the encounter left her deeply unsettled. Alexander had recognized her name, not with surprise, but almost as if solving a puzzle. By 8 o'clock, the mansion transformed. String lights twinkled across the garden. Well-dressed guests filled the ballroom, their jewelry catching the chandelier light as waitstaff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Maya worked efficiently, keeping her head down while scanning the room occasionally for her father. Joseph had insisted on performing limited duties, greeting guests at the entrance before retreating to supervise from a corner. Richard Thornton worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands and laughing warmly. Alexander, meanwhile, held court with a group of young executives, his voice carrying across the room. "Father says I'm too aggressive with acquisitions," he announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "But when you're born with the Thornton instinct, you have to use it." His companions laughed appreciatively. Maya moved through the crowd with her tray of champagne flutes, maintaining a professional smile despite the ache in her feet. She'd almost reached a group of older women when Alexander clinked his glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming." His confident voice silenced the room. 30 years. They say it's when a man truly comes into his own. Scattered applause followed. "My father built this company with vision, but in the past year under my direction, we've increased profits by 22%. Alexander raised his glass higher. "To the inevitable success that comes with superior breeding and natural talent. Some people spend their lives struggling uphill, but when you're born at the summit, the view is always clear. Maya paused near a group of businessmen, her knuckles white around her serving tray. Alexander's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Joseph in the corner. "To the Thornton legacy," Alexander continued, "and to knowing the difference between those born to lead and those born to serve." The guests raised their glasses, though Maya noticed Richard watching his son with a slight frown. As people applauded, Alexander turned suddenly, nearly colliding with Maya. Their eyes met, and his mouth curled into a knowing smirk. "Careful with that champagne," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "We wouldn't want accidents from staff who are overreaching their qualifications." Something snapped inside Maya. She opened her mouth to respond when she spotted her father across the room, subtly shaking his head in warning. Joseph's face had gone pale again, one hand resting on his chest. Her anger instantly transformed to concern. In her distraction, her hand trembled. The champagne sloshed over the rim of the glasses, splashing across Alexander's pristine white shirt and expensive jacket. Gasps rippled through the nearby guests. Alexander looked down at the spreading stain, his expression morphing from shock to cold fury. I'm so sorry," Maya stammered, genuine horror replacing her anger. Alexander's eyes found hers, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper only she could hear. "You'll regret that mistake, Ms. Johnson. I promise you." As waitstaff rushed forward with napkins, Maya caught her father's worried gaze across the room. In that moment, she knew the evening had just become much more complicated and potentially disastrous for them both. The champagne dripped from Alexander's designer jacket, the golden liquid darkening the fabric with each passing second. Maya stood frozen, tray still in hand, aware of all eyes on them. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thornton," she repeated, reaching for her serving napkin. Alexander grabbed her wrist before she could touch him, squeezing just hard enough to make his point. His smile remained perfectly in place for the watching guests, but his eyes burned with controlled rage. "No need," he said smoothly, releasing her. "Accidents happen, especially with untrained staff." Richard Thornton appeared suddenly at his son's side, breaking the tension. "Come now, Alex. Let's get you cleaned up." He turned to Maya with a kind but dismissive nod. "Perhaps you should help in the kitchen for a while." Maya retreated quickly, burning with embarrassment. As she pushed through the kitchen doors, she caught Alexander's final glance, cold and calculating. She'd seen that look before, on surgeons deciding where to make their first cut. "What happened out there?" Mrs. Wilson asked, eyeing Maya's shaken expression. "I spilled champagne on Alexander Thornton." The kitchen fell silent. One of the servers whistled low. "On purpose?" someone asked. "No, of course not." But even as she denied it, Maya wasn't entirely sure. Had some part of her wanted to humiliate him after his arrogant speech? Mrs. Wilson squeezed her shoulder. "Stay in here for now. I'll check on your father. He was looking peaked earlier." Maya busied herself washing glasses, her mind replaying Alexander's whispered threat. Losing this job would mean no money for her father's treatment. Worse, if Alexander decided to make trouble for Joseph. 20 minutes later, the kitchen doors swung open. Richard Thornton entered, his expression troubled. "Has anyone seen my son? He changed his shirt but hasn't returned to the party." The staff shook their heads. Richard's eyes found Maya. "Ms. Johnson, isn't it? No harm done about earlier. These things happen." Maya nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir." As Richard turned to leave, the event coordinator rushed in, phone in hand, face pale with panic. "Mr. Thornton, the pianist, Mr. Zakarian, he's canceled. Car accident on the highway. He's fine, but he can't make it, and the guests are expecting music in 10 minutes. Richard frowned. "Can we find a replacement?" "At this hour? For a performance of this caliber? Impossible." The kitchen erupted with suggestions, streaming music, calling other musicians, even asking if any guests might perform. Maya kept her head down, focusing on the glasses, trying to make herself invisible. The doors swung open again. Alexander strode in wearing a fresh shirt and jacket, his hair slightly damp from washing away the champagne. His eyes locked immediately on Maya. "What's the commotion about?" he asked, though his gaze never left her face. The pianist canceled, Richard explained. Clarence is having a meltdown. Alexander tilted his head, watching Maya. That is unfortunate. Something in his tone made Maya look up. Alexander was staring at her with an unsettling intensity, a slow smile spreading across his face. Dad, why don't we use the Steinway in the ballroom? It's been tuned recently, hasn't it? Richard nodded. Yes, but without a pianist, I'm sure we can find someone. Alexander's smile widened as he kept his eyes fixed on Maya. After all, we have a house full of talented individuals. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She returned to washing glasses but could feel Alexander watching her. Ms. Johnson, he said suddenly, you seemed quite fascinated by our piano earlier. The kitchen went quiet. Maya looked up slowly, heart pounding. I noticed it, yes. It's beautiful. Do you play? Alexander's question seemed innocent, but his eyes glittered with something darker. Before Maya could answer, Joseph appeared at the kitchen entrance. He looked better than earlier, but still too pale. Mr. Alexander, the first guests are asking about the music program. Alexander barely glanced at Joseph. Perfect timing, Joseph. I was just asking your daughter if she plays the piano. Joseph's expression remained carefully neutral. Sir? I noticed her admiring our Steinway earlier. Alexander continued, circling Maya like a shark. And we find ourselves without a pianist. Perhaps Ms. Johnson might assist us. The trap was perfectly laid. Maya felt herself caught between humiliation and panic. I don't think, she began. Oh, don't be modest, Alexander cut in. Unless, of course, you only admire instruments you can't actually play. The challenge hung in the air. Maya looked to her father, whose face had gone completely still. A stillness she recognized from childhood whenever something serious was happening. Richard cleared his throat. Alex, I'm sure Ms. Johnson isn't comfortable performing for a crowd like this. We can simply use recorded music. Nonsense. Alexander placed his hand on Maya's shoulder, the gesture appearing friendly to observers but feeling like a shackle to her. I insist. I've been told I have an eye for hidden talent. Maya caught his meaning instantly. This was her punishment. To be paraded in front of wealthy, judgmental socialites and forced to reveal her inadequacy. Refuse and risk both her and her father's position. Accept and face public humiliation. Well, Ms. Johnson? Alexander's voice dripped with false encouragement. Will you help us out of this predicament? After all, we're a bit soaked in troubles tonight. The kitchen staff watched in uncomfortable silence. Joseph took a step forward, concern evident in his eyes. But before he could intervene, Richard spoke. That's actually a wonderful idea, if Miss Johnson is willing. Eleanor always said music brings people together. At the mention of Eleanor Thornton, Alexander's expression flickered briefly before his smug smile returned. Maya felt trapped, cornered by Alexander's scheme. As she searched for a response, her father's eyes met hers, communicating something urgent she couldn't quite decipher. The kitchen felt suddenly airless as all eyes turned to Maya. Alexander's trap was perfectly set. Refuse and appear ungrateful. Accept and face certain humiliation. Either way, he would win. Maya hesitated, searching for an excuse that wouldn't sound like cowardice. Joseph stepped forward, his voice quiet but clear. Mr. Alexander, my daughter hasn't played in years. Perhaps another solution. Years. Alexander raised an eyebrow. So she does play. Maya shot her father a panicked look. Joseph's slip had only made things worse. Richard Thornton rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Music is like riding a bicycle, isn't it? You never truly forget. Exactly, Alexander agreed, false warmth coating his words. And we're hardly expecting Carnegie Hall quality. Just a few simple tunes to entertain our guests while they enjoy their drinks. The event coordinator checked his watch anxiously. Mr. Thornton, we really need to decide. The schedule. It's decided, Alexander interrupted. Ms. Johnson will perform. He turned to Maya with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Unless you're refusing to help us in this emergency? Maya felt trapped in quicksand. The more she struggled, the deeper she sank. She glanced at her father, surprised to find his expression had changed from concern to something more complex. "Dad?" she whispered. Joseph approached slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "May I speak with my daughter privately for a moment?" he asked. Alexander shrugged. "Make it quick. Our guests are waiting." Joseph led Maya to the small pantry off the kitchen. When the door closed behind them, he took a deep breath. "Maya, you don't have to do this." "If I don't, he'll make things difficult for you," she whispered fiercely. "I saw how he looked at you earlier, talking about people born to serve. He's looking for any excuse to push you out." Joseph smiled sadly. "I've survived far worse than Alexander Thornton. But your health, this isn't about me." Joseph's eyes held a strange intensity. "Or Alexander. Some things are meant to happen, even if we don't understand why." Maya stared at him, confused. "Dad, what are you talking about?" He took her hands in his. "Do you remember when you were 7 and you used to disappear for hours in this house?" The question startled her. "Vaguely. You brought me to work sometimes when Mom had late shifts at the hospital. And do you remember where you went during those hours?" Maya's brow furrowed. Fragmented memories flickered. A sunlit room, the smell of lavender, gentle laughter. "Not really. It was so long ago." Joseph's eyes glistened. "Your mother wanted you to forget. After Mrs. Eleanor died, she thought it would be easier that way." He straightened his shoulders suddenly. "Maya, when you walk out there, remember who you are, not who they think you are." "But I haven't played in—" "Your hands remember." He touched her fingers gently. "Your heart remembers." Before she could question him further, the pantry door opened. Mrs. Wilson looked apologetic. "They're asking for you both." Joseph nodded solemnly. "We're coming." As they returned to the kitchen, Alexander's impatient figure loomed by the door. "Finally," he said. "The natives are getting restless." Richard approached, genuinely concerned. "Ms. Johnson, please don't feel pressured. We can find another solution." Maya looked from Richard's kind face to Alexander's smug one, then to her father's resolute expression. Something inside her shifted, a quiet determination replacing her fear. "I'll do it," she said simply. Alexander's smile widened. "Excellent. I'll announce you myself." As they walked toward the ballroom, Maya felt as though she were moving through a dream. Guests turned to stare as Alexander guided her through the crowd. Her waitress uniform suddenly felt conspicuous among designer gowns and tailored suits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander announced, his voice carrying across the room. "Our scheduled pianist has encountered an unfortunate delay. However, we're in luck. One of our own staff has volunteered to entertain us." Curious murmurs rippled through the crowd. In the corner, Maya spotted her father standing beside Richard Thornton. Joseph gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Ms. Johnson," Alexander continued, gesturing dramatically toward Maya, "works for us serving drinks, but apparently has other talents. She's kindly agreed to demonstrate them for us tonight." His emphasis left little doubt about his expectations of her failure. The magnificent Steinway waited at the center of the room, its lid raised like a black wing under the chandelier light. Maya approached slowly, aware of every eye watching her journey. Alexander leaned close as they reached the piano. "Don't worry," he whispered for her ears only. "Even bad entertainment can be amusing." With that final jab, he stepped back, joining a group of his friends who watched with barely concealed amusement. One of them whispered something that made the others snicker. Maya stood before the piano, her heart thundering in her chest. The keyboard gleamed before her, 88 keys, black and white, waiting in silent judgment. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not since... Since when? The memory danced just beyond her reach. She sat on the bench, its familiar firmness somehow comforting. The ballroom fell silent. Even the servers paused, trays suspended midair. Maya placed her hands above the keys, horrified to find them trembling visibly. From across the room, she heard Alexander's friend stage whisper, "This should be interesting." Her fingers hovered, frozen with doubt. Then, from somewhere deep in her memory, she heard a gentle voice. Music isn't in your fingers, Maya. It's in your heart. Your fingers just need to follow. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Maya's fingers hovered above the keyboard, the weight of dozens of judgmental stares pressing down on her shoulders. Alexander and his friends exchanged smirks in the corner. Waitstaff paused with their trays, expressions torn between sympathy and curiosity. Her father stood perfectly still, his eyes never leaving her. She closed her eyes, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. And then she played. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major flowed from her fingers, delicate, precise, haunting. The familiar melody emerged not as the hesitant attempt Alexander expected, but with the confidence of someone intimately acquainted with every note. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Maya's hands moved across the keyboard with fluid grace, each note ringing clear and true. The technical complexity of the piece revealed itself naturally under her touch, the left hand providing a gentle pulse while her right spun the achingly beautiful melody above it. In the corner, Alexander's smug smile froze, then slowly faded. As Maya played, the ballroom disappeared around her. Instead, she was 7 years old again, sitting beside an elegant woman on this very bench. That's it, Maya. Feel the music breathe. Chopin should sound like a whispered secret. The woman's hands guided hers, smelling faintly of lavender. Eleanor Thornton's smile was kind. Her blue eyes, so like her son's, filled with genuine warmth. "But why must it be our secret, Mrs. Eleanor?" young Maya asked. "Daddy says secrets aren't good." Eleanor's laugh was musical. "Some secrets protect beautiful things until they're ready to bloom, like planting seeds in winter." The memory dissolved as Maya reached the piece's emotional center, her fingers coaxing a depth of feeling from the instrument that belied her years away from it. The music filled the high-ceilinged room, wrapping around the stunned audience. Richard Thornton had gone completely still, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he watched Maya play, seeing someone else in her movements. Near the refreshment table, the event coordinator whispered to Mrs. Wilson, "Who is she really? That's not amateur playing." Maya's body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her face transformed by the music. Gone was the nervous waitress, replaced by an artist lost in her craft. Her fingers knew exactly where to land, muscle memory overriding the years of absence. It was as if the piano itself recognized her touch and responded with its fullest voice. Alexander stepped closer, his expression shifting from disbelief to dawning recognition. Something about the way she played, the particular tilt of her head, the fluid wrist movements, struck a chord of familiarity he couldn't immediately place. Across the room, Dr. Lawrence Harrington, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair, had stopped mid-conversation. As director of the National Conservatory of Music, he recognized exceptional talent instantly. He watched Maya with growing amazement, whispering to his companion, "That technique, it reminds me of Eleanor's playing." Maya transitioned seamlessly into the piece's final section, where the melody returns with greater emotional impact. Her fingers danced across the keys with both technical precision and emotional intelligence. As the final notes approached, she allowed them to linger just slightly longer than written, a subtle artistic choice that Eleanor had once taught her. "Music isn't just notes on a page, Maya," Eleanor had said, her hands gracefully demonstrating. "It's the space between the notes, the breath, the waiting. That's where the soul lives." The final chord resonated through the ballroom, hanging in the air like suspended crystal. When it finally faded, the room remained absolutely silent. Maya opened her eyes, suddenly aware again of where she was and what she had done. The memory of Eleanor's lessons had flooded back completely, along with the realization that she hadn't forgotten a single thing the woman had taught her. She looked up to find the entire room staring at her in stunned silence. Alexander stood nearest to the piano, his face drained of color, arrogance replaced by something resembling shock. His friends had stopped snickering, their expressions showing equal parts surprise and embarrassment. Richard Thornton took a step forward, his hand pressed against his chest. There was something in his eyes Maya couldn't quite read. Grief, wonder, recognition. For a moment he seemed about to speak, then composed himself with visible effort. The silence stretched unbearably until Joseph, still standing in his corner, began to applaud. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the entire room erupted in enthusiastic applause. Guests who moments before had viewed her as merely the help now regarded her with newfound respect and curiosity. Whispers swept through the crowd. Who is she? Where did she study? Did you see Richard's face? Maya's hands trembled now that they were still. The rush of memory had left her feeling exposed, vulnerable. Playing Eleanor's favorite piece on Eleanor's piano had awakened something long dormant inside her. Dr. Harrington made his way toward the piano, his experienced eyes evaluating her with professional interest. But before he could reach her, Alexander intercepted him, whispering something urgently in the older man's ear while glancing repeatedly at Maya. Richard approached slowly, looking as though he had seen a ghost. "That was," he began, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "Young lady, where did you learn to play like that?" Before Maya could answer, her eyes found her father's across the room. Joseph stood tall, pride evident in his stance despite the tears tracking silently down his weathered cheeks. His slight nod told her everything. It was time for the truth to emerge. "I learned here, Mr. Thornton," Maya said quietly, "in this house, on this piano." "In this house? On this piano?" Richard Thornton repeated Maya's words, his voice barely above a whisper. The ballroom remained unnaturally quiet despite being filled with people. Maya nodded, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. The waitress uniform that had made her invisible minutes ago now seemed to spotlight her under the crystal chandeliers. Dr. Lawrence Harrington finally reached her side, gently moving past Alexander, who stood frozen in place. "My dear," Dr. Harrington said, extending his hand, "I'm Lawrence Harrington, Director of the National Conservatory." "Dr. Harrington," Maya acknowledged, recognizing the name instantly. Eleanor had spoken of him often. That interpretation of Chopin was— He paused, searching for the right words. "I've only heard it played with that particular phrasing by one other person." Richard's eyes snapped to Harrington's face. "You noticed it too, Lawrence. The extended pause before the recapitulation? The slight rubato in the coda?" Harrington nodded. "Eleanor's signature touches." At the mention of his mother's name, Alexander's expression shifted from shock to something more complex. Confusion mingled with the first hints of understanding. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests pressed closer, the invisible barrier between servers and served temporarily dissolved by the power of Maya's performance. The wealthy patrons who had barely glanced at her while she carried trays now studied her with intense curiosity. "Perhaps," Richard suggested, his voice steadier now, "you might play something else for us?" Maya hesitated, looking toward her father. Joseph gave an almost imperceptible nod, his eyes shining with pride. "I'd be honored," she said, turning back to the keyboard. This time she chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, another piece Eleanor had loved. As the impressionistic harmonies floated through the air, the remaining tension in the room dissolved completely. Guests found seats or leaned against walls, champagne forgotten in their hands as they listened. Dr. Harrington watched with professional appreciation, occasionally nodding at particularly well-executed passages. "Extraordinary control," he whispered to Richard. "This isn't just talent. This is years of high-level training." Alexander had retreated slightly, his back against a column, his face unreadable. The friends who had been snickering earlier now stood awkwardly apart from him, shooting confused glances his way. From her position at the piano, Maya could see her father standing straighter than he had in months, as though her music had temporarily lifted the weight of his illness. Next to him, Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. As Maya played, memories continued flooding back. Eleanor's patient guidance, the secret lessons during Joseph's working hours, the joy of making music in this very room. Each note seemed to break down another wall in her mind, revealing the past she'd deliberately packed away. When she finished the Debussy piece, the applause was immediate and genuine. Maya rose from the bench, slightly unsteady after the emotional experience. Richard approached her again, this time with more composure. "Ms. Johnson, would you honor me with a brief conversation in the library? I believe there are matters we should discuss." Before Maya could respond, Alexander stepped forward. "Father, the guests," he began. "Will be perfectly fine." Richard cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "Dr. Harrington can introduce our scheduled string quartet." They finally arrived. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Maya glanced toward Joseph, who gave her a reassuring nod before approaching Richard. "Sir," Joseph said quietly, "perhaps I should accompany my daughter." Richard's expression softened. "Of course, Joseph. In fact, your presence is essential." As they moved toward the library door, Maya found herself face to face with Alexander. The arrogance had drained from his features, replaced by confusion and a reluctant respect. "That wasn't beginner's luck," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "No," Maya replied simply. "It wasn't. How did you—" "Alex," Richard called from the doorway, "you should join us." Alexander looked surprised at the invitation but nodded, following them into the library. The magnificent room, lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive oak desk, felt suddenly intimate and solemn. Richard closed the door, muffling the sounds of the party. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the leather armchairs arranged near the fireplace. Maya sat, her father taking the chair beside her. Alexander remained standing, leaning against a bookshelf, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. Richard walked to a cabinet and withdrew a framed photograph. He studied it for a long moment before handing it to Maya. "This was taken 14 years ago," he said quietly. Maya looked down at the image and felt her breath catch. There she was, a small girl of 9, seated at the Steinway with Eleanor Thornton beside her, both of their hands on the keys, both smiling at the camera. Maya had forgotten this photograph existed. "I found this among Eleanor's things after she died," Richard continued. "At the time, I assumed it was just a nice moment. The housekeeper's daughter showing interest in music, my wife being kind enough to indulge her." He paused, his voice growing thicker. "But it was more than that, wasn't it?" Joseph stepped forward. "Sir, I can explain." "No need, old friend," Richard said gently. "I'm beginning to understand on my own." Alexander pushed away from the bookshelf, reaching for the photograph. When he saw it, his expression darkened. "You knew my mother?" he asked Maya, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "I did," Maya answered softly. "She was my teacher." "Teacher?" Alexander repeated, looking from Maya to his father to Joseph, as though one of them might explain the joke. "That's impossible. My mother never mentioned teaching anyone." "There's a great deal your mother never mentioned," Richard said, his eyes never leaving Maya's face, "including why the daughter of our butler plays piano exactly like Eleanor Thornton." The library fell into tense silence. Maya stared at the photograph in Alexander's hands, tangible proof of a past she'd nearly forgotten. Eleanor Thornton's gentle smile looked back at her, a ghostly reminder of what had been lost. "I was 7 when it started," Maya said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "My father would bring me to work when my mother had hospital shifts. I was supposed to stay in the staff quarters, but I'd wander." Richard nodded encouragingly. Children rarely follow rules about boundaries. "One day, I found my way to the music room. Mrs. Thornton was playing." Maya closed her eyes briefly, remembering. Bach, the well-tempered clavier. I'd never heard anything so beautiful. I thought I was hidden behind the door, just listening. But she knew I was there. Joseph shifted in his chair. "I was horrified when I found out. A staff member's child disturbing Mrs. Thornton. I was certain I'd lose my position." Richard's expression softened. "But Eleanor had other ideas." Maya nodded. "Instead of being angry, she invited me to sit beside her. She asked if I wanted to learn. When I said yes, she placed my fingers on the keys and taught me a simple melody." The memory warmed her voice. "I thought it was just that one time, but the next week she asked my father if I could come again." Alexander set the photograph down carefully, as if it might shatter. "My mother gave you piano lessons? For how long?" "3 years," Maya replied, "until she became too ill." "3 years," Alexander repeated, disbelief coloring his words. "I was away at boarding school most of that time, but still, how did I not know?" Richard sighed heavily. Eleanor kept many things private, especially in her final years. The doctors had told her to rest, to conserve her energy. Instead, she found Maya. Joseph stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, I want you to know I tried to stop it. I told Eleanor it wasn't appropriate, that people would talk. And knowing Eleanor," Richard said with a sad smile, "she completely ignored you." "She said she'd found something rare," Joseph admitted, "a natural talent that reminded her of herself as a child. She made me promise not to interfere." Maya looked up at Alexander, whose face had become unreadable. "Your mother gave me something precious, not just music lessons. She believed in me when no one else did." Richard moved to an antique desk in the corner and unlocked a drawer. He removed a slender folder and returned to the group. "After Eleanor passed," he said, opening the folder, "I found this among her papers." He handed Maya a document. At the top, elegant script read, "Trust Fund for Maya Johnson's Education." Maya's hands trembled as she scanned the paper. "I don't understand." "Eleanor established a trust fund for you before she died," Richard explained. "It was her wish that you receive proper musical training. She named me as trustee, with instructions to ensure your education continued. But then you disappeared." Maya looked at her father in confusion. Joseph's expression was pained. "After Mrs. Eleanor died, your mother and we thought it best to sever ties with the music world. We wanted you to pursue something more practical." "So you knew about this?" Maya asked, the betrayal evident in her voice. "Not the trust fund," Joseph said quickly. "But I knew Mrs. Eleanor had plans for your musical education. When she passed, we moved to my sister's place in Baltimore. Your mother insisted you focus on academics instead." Alexander, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "So, while I was sent to expensive boarding schools and told my mother was too ill for visits, she was here giving piano lessons to the butler's daughter?" Richard flinched at the bitterness in his son's voice. "Alex, that's not fair. Your mother loved you deeply. Her illness made traditional parenting difficult, but she never stopped. Yet somehow she found strength for Maya." Alexander cut in, his words sharp but controlled. "The mysterious talent I've just discovered exists, who plays exactly like my mother." Dr. Harrington chose that moment to enter the library, closing the door quietly behind him. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing as I approached." He turned to Maya. "Young lady, your performance was extraordinary. The string quartet has the guests' attention now, but they're still talking about you." Richard gestured for Harrington to join them. "Lawrence, you knew Eleanor better than anyone except me. What do you make of this?" Harrington studied Maya thoughtfully. "Eleanor always had an eye for exceptional talent. But this," he shook his head in wonder, "this is more than talent identification. Maya plays with Eleanor's very soul. Her phrasing, her touch, even her posture. It's as if Eleanor transferred not just her knowledge but her musical spirit." Maya felt tears threatening. "She told me music was the purest form of communication, that when words failed, notes could speak." "Classic Eleanor," Harrington murmured. Then, more clearly, "Young woman, where have you been training since Eleanor's passing? Your technique should have deteriorated over time without proper instruction, yet it's impeccable." Maya looked down at her hands. "I haven't played in years. Not since I started pre-med." The three men stared at her in disbelief. "Impossible," Harrington declared. "No one maintains that level of proficiency without practice." "Unless," Richard said quietly. "Eleanor's teaching went deeper than we realize." Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the garden where guests mingled with champagne glasses. His reflection in the glass showed a man struggling to reconcile past and present. "So, this trust fund," he said without turning. "How much are we talking about?" "Alex," Richard admonished. "It's a fair question," Alexander countered, turning back to face them. "If my mother secretly diverted family funds—" "She didn't," Richard interrupted firmly. "Eleanor used her personal inheritance from her grandmother, money that was hers alone to allocate." Maya stood suddenly, unable to process everything. "I never knew about any trust fund. I've been working 3 jobs to pay for medical school. My father's heart condition has drained our savings for treatments insurance won't cover. If there was money set aside for me, where has it been all these years?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's expression shifted from surprise to comprehension to something that looked remarkably like guilt. "I think," he said slowly, "we have much more to discuss." Richard's admission hung heavily in the air. Maya's question about the missing trust fund had struck a nerve, revealing yet another layer to the complex history connecting everyone in the room. "Perhaps," Joseph said, breaking the tense silence, "I should explain why Maya left music behind." All eyes turned to the elderly butler, who suddenly looked every one of his 67 years. He sat straighter in his chair, summoning dignity despite his obvious fatigue. "After Eleanor passed, my wife was adamant that Maya focus on academics," Joseph began. "She believed music was a beautiful but impractical dream, one that would lead to struggle rather than stability." Maya touched her father's arm gently. "Mom was scared for me. She'd seen too many talented people working hospital janitorial jobs at night while auditioning during the day." "So you just gave it up?" Alexander asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier bitterness. "Something you were clearly born to do?" Maya met his gaze steadily. 5 years ago, my father had his first heart attack. I was in my freshman year of college studying music theory on scholarship at Peabody." Richard's eyebrows rose in recognition of the prestigious conservatory. "The doctors said he needed specialized care. Treatments our insurance wouldn't cover," Maya continued. "My mother had already passed by then, so it was just us. The choice became clear: music or medicine." "You chose medicine to save your father," Dr. Harrington said softly, recognition dawning in his eyes. Maya nodded. "I transferred to pre-med, worked multiple jobs to pay for classes. Every spare minute went to studying." "And the piano?" Dr. Harrington asked. "I sold mine to pay for textbooks," Maya replied simply. "Told myself it was just an object, that the music would always be inside me." Alexander moved closer, his earlier hostility noticeably absent. "So tonight was the first time you've played in—" "5 years." Dr. Harrington shook his head in amazement. "In my 40 years teaching music, I've never witnessed anything like this. Technique typically deteriorates without practice. Yet yours—" "Eleanor always said Maya had a photographic memory for music," Joseph added. "She could hear a piece once and play it back with minimal errors." Richard leaned forward, hands clasped in front of him. "Maya, about the trust fund. You deserve an explanation." Before he could continue, a knock interrupted them. Mrs. Wilson peeked in, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but the guests are asking about Mr. Alexander. The toast to the birthday celebrant is scheduled now." Alexander waved dismissively. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." As Mrs. Wilson withdrew, Alexander turned back to the group, his expression transformed from the arrogant man who had tried to humiliate Maya just an hour earlier. "We need to return to the party," he said, "but this conversation isn't over." He paused, struggling with something internal. "Ms. Johnson, Maya, would you join us? Play something else for the guests?" The sincere request surprised everyone, especially Maya. Yes, I could do that." They moved toward the door, but Alexander suddenly stopped, turning to face Maya directly. "Before we go out there, I need to say something." He took a deep breath, his usual confidence replaced by genuine vulnerability. "I behaved abominably toward you. My intention was to humiliate you in front of everyone." Maya nodded, appreciating his directness. "I know. What I don't understand is why," he admitted, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time that evening. "Why did I feel such immediate hostility toward you?" "Perhaps," Richard suggested quietly, because unconsciously you recognize something of your mother in her, something you've been missing. Alexander considered this, his eyes studying Maya with new awareness. Maybe. He straightened his shoulders. Regardless, I owe you a public apology. That's not necessary, Maya began. It is, Alexander insisted. You deserve that much, at minimum. As they returned to the ballroom, the crowd's attention immediately focused on them. The string quartet paused between pieces, and conversations quieted. Alexander guided Maya toward the center of the room, his hand respectfully at her elbow rather than gripping her shoulder as he had earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying across the space, I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate with me tonight. Polite applause followed. However, Alexander continued, I need to address something important. He glanced at Maya. Earlier this evening, I attempted to embarrass Ms. Johnson by putting her in what I thought would be an uncomfortable position. I expected, even wanted, her to fail. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Such public admissions were rare in their social circle. Instead, Alexander's voice softened, she showed extraordinary grace and talent. What you witnessed wasn't just beautiful music. It was the legacy of my mother, Eleanor Thornton, living on through her student. The room went completely silent. My mother, it seems, recognized in Maya what I failed to see, genuine brilliance that transcends social boundaries and preconceptions. Alexander turned to face Maya directly. I'm deeply sorry for my behavior and incredibly grateful that your talent couldn't be diminished by my pettiness. Maya felt tears threatening but maintained her composure. Alexander's words seemed genuinely heartfelt, nothing like the calculated charm he'd displayed earlier. Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder with obvious pride. Tonight was meant to celebrate Alexander's 30th birthday. Richard addressed the guests. Instead, it's become something more meaningful, a rediscovery of Eleanor's legacy and a reminder that true talent deserves recognition regardless of its source. Dr. Harrington approached the piano. If Ms. Johnson is willing, I believe we'd all be honored to hear another piece. As Maya moved toward the Steinway once more, Alexander caught her hand briefly. Thank you, he said quietly, for showing me what my mother saw in you. His eyes, so like Eleanor's, held genuine emotion. I think I've spent years looking for her, never realizing her gifts were still here, just waiting to be recognized. For the first time since entering the Thornton mansion that morning, Maya felt something shift between them. Not friendship exactly, but a bridge beginning to form over a chasm that had seemed uncrossable hours before. Maya's second performance captivated the audience even more than the first. She chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, her fingers commanding the powerful chords with precision and passion. As the final notes faded, the spontaneous standing ovation felt like a collective exhale of emotion. Dr. Harrington approached immediately after she finished, his eyes gleaming with professional excitement. Ms. Johnson, he said, I've spent 40 years identifying musical talent, and I can say with absolute certainty that yours is exceptional. He handed her his business card. I'd like to discuss your future when you have a moment. Maya took the card hesitantly. Dr. Harrington, I'm honored, but my path is medicine now. I'm halfway through medical school. Perhaps the paths need not be separate, he suggested. The conservatory has recently established a dual program with Johns Hopkins Medical School, music therapy and neuroscience. Only 2 students per year are accepted. He smiled warmly. It was actually inspired by Eleanor's research on music's healing properties. Maya stared at him in disbelief. I didn't know Mrs. Eleanor did research. Oh yes, Dr. Harrington nodded. Before her illness progressed, she was pioneering work on music's effects on cardiac patients. Richard funded the research privately. As if summoned by his name, Richard Thornton joined them, Joseph following close behind. Lawrence is right, Richard confirmed. Eleanor always believed music had healing power. Her own heart condition improved temporarily when she played or taught. His gaze shifted between Maya and Joseph. Which brings me to something important I need to address. He guided them to a quieter corner of the ballroom. Alexander noticed and joined them, his demeanor sobered by the evening's revelations. "Joseph," Richard began, "I owe both you and Maya an explanation about the trust fund." Joseph straightened, his butler's training still evident despite his weakened state. "Sir, you don't owe us anything." "I do." Richard's voice was firm. "When you and Maya disappeared after Eleanor's death, I tried to locate you, but you'd moved without leaving contact information." Joseph looked down. "My sister suggested a fresh start, away from painful memories." "Understandable," Richard acknowledged. "However, as trustee of Eleanor's fund for Maya, I had a responsibility. When I finally located you 3 years later, I discovered Maya had abandoned music for pre-med studies." Maya's eyes widened. "You knew where we were?" Richard nodded. "I respected your family's choice to start fresh, but I couldn't ignore Eleanor's wishes entirely. So I made a decision." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I redirected the trust fund to anonymously cover your medical school tuition." "The mystery scholarship?" Maya gasped. "That was you?" "Eleanor wanted to secure your musical education, but I believed she would have supported your medical aspirations too, especially given the circumstances." Richard looked at Joseph. "I also arranged for additional medical coverage for Joseph through the Thornton Foundation's Employee Legacy Program." Joseph's expression reflected dawning comprehension. "The insurance appeals that mysteriously resolved in our favor were my doing," Richard admitted. "Not charity, Joseph. Fulfilling Eleanor's wishes to care for your family." Alexander, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. "Father, why didn't you tell me any of this? You were dealing with your own grief, Alex. And frankly, you weren't ready to understand Eleanor's vision of using our privilege to elevate others." Alexander flinched at the gentle rebuke, but didn't argue. "Moving forward," Richard continued, "I'd like to formalize what has been happening in the shadows." He turned to Maya. "The Thornton Foundation would like to establish the Eleanor Thornton Fellowship for Arts and Medicine, with you as its first recipient." Maya struggled to find words. "Mr. Thornton, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Alexander interjected, surprising everyone. "And let me add something." He faced Joseph directly. "Mr. Johnson, I want to personally fund your complete cardiac treatment at Mercy Medical Center. Their new regenerative program is showing remarkable results." Joseph began to protest, but Alexander raised his hand. "This isn't charity or guilt money. Consider it repayment of a debt my family has owed yours for years. Your dedication enabled my father's success while your daughter preserved a piece of my mother I thought was lost forever." The sincerity in his voice left no room for argument. 6 months later, the Thornton Mansion's ballroom was transformed once again. This time, a benefit concert for the newly established Eleanor Thornton Foundation for Arts and Medicine took center stage. Reporters from major newspapers covered the event, fascinated by the story of the waitress-turned-medical student who had stunned the music world. Maya, dressed in an elegant blue gown instead of a server's uniform, sat before the Steinway. Beside her on the bench was Alexander, whose rediscovered interest in piano had blossomed into dedicated practice over the past months. In the front row, Joseph watched with pride, his color significantly improved after successful treatment. Beside him sat Richard, the two old friends now openly acknowledging their deep connection through decades of shared history. Dr. Harrington, now the director of the joint program Maya had joined, introduced the evening's performance, a four-hands arrangement of Schubert that Eleanor had once played with her instructor. As Maya and Alexander began to play together, their hands moving in perfect synchronization across the keyboard, the audience witnessed more than beautiful music. They saw the physical embodiment of bridges built across social divides, of talent recognized regardless of background, and of healing that extended beyond medicine. "Music isn't just notes on a page," Maya had told a reporter earlier. "It's the spaces between, the connections we form when we truly listen to each other." In the warm glow of the chandeliers, Eleanor's legacy lived on through unexpected channels. The piano that had once been an instrument of attempted humiliation now served as the centerpiece of reconciliation and renewal. As the final chords of Schubert resonated through the ballroom, Maya caught her father's eye and smiled. The past 6 months had taught her that some journeys come full circle in ways we never expect, and that sometimes our truest path forward requires us to revisit what we thought we had left behind. Alexander's fingers completed the final phrase alongside hers, no longer a rival but a partner in preserving his mother's most important legacy, the belief that talent and compassion transcend all boundaries.